They said she was too wild for any man to tame, just another broken soul tossed to the highest bidder. But when a desperate rancher put down his last few dollars, neither knew fate had bound them together for something far greater than survival. The wind never seemed to rest in the western reaches of the frontier. It scoured the dry earth, lifted grit into the air, and whispered through the splintered fences of Eli McGraw's ranch. Dust clung to his boots, his shirt, even the lines of his weary face. A man in his late 30s, though older in his eyes, Eli carried the mark of drought and sorrow. Once he had a wife, soft laughter echoing in the small clapboard house by the barn, but the fever carried her off 2 winters back. Since then, the land had turned meaner, the cattle thinner, and the nights longer. He had tried to hold on to what was his. He patched the roofs, prayed for rain, worked until his hands bled. But the creditors didn't care for prayers, and the dry creek beds didn't yield water no matter how hard he worked. By spring, Eli McGraw found himself at the stockyard auction, not as a bidder for cattle, but desperate enough to throw in his lot for something else, someone else. That day, the auction yard smelled of sweat, horses, and dust. Men gathered in clusters, rough ranchers, gamblers, drifters, all drawn to the spectacle advertised in whispers. A girl too wild for any man. The talk circled her like buzzards. How she'd bitten one rancher, broken another man's nose. How no whip nor chain could keep her quiet. Eli had no interest in the gossip until he saw her, standing there. Clara May. She looked younger than him, but her eyes held the kind of fire that came from walking through storms alone. Shackles bit at her wrists, but her chin was lifted, her shoulders squared. When the auctioneer barked for bids, the men jeered and laughed, some tossing coins into the dirt as if buying her was a game. Clara's gaze met Eli's across the crowd. He expected defiance, but what he saw instead was a dare, as though she were measuring him, testing the weight of his soul without a word spoken. He hadn't meant to raise his hand. Truth be told, he didn't even have much left to wager. But in that moment, with the hot sun beating down and 100 voices jeering, Eli McGraw lifted his hand and bought the girl they called untamable. The crowd roared with laughter at the fool rancher who spent his last coin on trouble. The trail back to his land was silent. Clara rode beside him, hands free now, her dark hair snapping in the wind like a banner. She didn't thank him, didn't curse him either. She only studied him, and when the dust finally settled around the ranch, she swung down from her horse and walked the place as though she owned it. Her boots crunched against the hard-pan earth, eyes flicking from the barn to the corrals, the sagging fences to the weary cattle. "This all you've got left?" she asked, voice low, edged with something too sharp to be pity. Eli bristled but nodded. "It's enough to make do." She gave him a look that said otherwise, but didn't press. Instead, she knelt beside the fence, tugged at the rotted wood, and muttered, "Won't hold through the next wind." Her hands, scarred and strong, worked quickly to lash it tighter with a strip of rawhide. He watched her, unsettled. She moved not like a broken soul, but like someone who'd been building, fighting, surviving her whole life. That night, over a fire of mesquite, Eli cooked beans in a battered pot. Clara sat across from him, knees drawn up, the flames painting her face in restless light. "You didn't buy me to keep house," she said plainly. "No," Eli answered, surprised by his own honesty. "I bought you because I couldn't stomach the thought of leaving you to that pack of wolves." Her eyes softened for a flicker, then hardened again. "I don't need saving." "I reckon not," he said. "But maybe I do." For the first time, she looked away, staring into the fire as though it reminded her of something far behind them both. Days turned into weeks, and Clara May proved herself every step of the way. She rose before dawn, tightened the fences, wrangled strays with a whistle that carried clear across the hills. She moved with horses like she'd been born in the saddle, breaking wild colts with patience and steel. Eli watched, torn between gratitude and bewilderment. No woman he'd ever known lived with such raw ferocity, such ease among sweat and danger. But she carried shadows too. At night, when the wind rattled loose boards and coyotes howled in the distance, Eli sometimes caught her staring across the desert, hand resting on the butt of a pistol she'd taken from his rack, without asking. Once, he found her whispering names into the dark. Names he didn't know. Names that seemed to burn her lips. The neighbors whispered as well. Word traveled fast on the frontier, and before long, men in town asked why Eli McGraw kept a girl with outlaw fire in her eyes. Some said she'd run with a gang before, that she was kin to killers and thieves. Eli didn't ask her, though the questions weighed heavy. He'd seen enough to know she wasn't ordinary, but he also knew enough about scars not to pick at hers. Then came the first sign of real trouble. A rider stumbled in one afternoon, bloodied and shaking, warning that the Durney gang had burned out a ranch to the south. They were taking cattle, burning homesteads, leaving nothing but ashes. The man's eyes darted toward Clara as he spoke, suspicion thick in his tone. Eli offered him water and sent him on his way, but the unease lingered. That evening, Clara leaned against the corral, arms folded. "It'll be here soon enough," she said flatly. Eli frowned. "What makes you so sure?" "Because I've seen men like them before. They don't stop at one ranch. They'll bleed this land dry until someone makes them pay." Her voice carried no fear, only certainty, and it chilled him. She knew too much. "Then maybe we ought to leave," Eli suggested, though even as he said it, the words tasted bitter. This was his home, his wife's grave on the hill, his last tether to something worth keeping. Clara turned to him, firelight catching her eyes. "You can run, but they'll follow. Or you can stand. I didn't come here to hide, McGraw. You think I'm too wild for any man, but the truth is, I've just been waiting for someone who won't flinch when the storm hits." Her words settled heavy between them. For the first time since he'd laid down those desperate coins, Eli McGraw felt something stir in him beyond grief or weariness. Maybe it was courage, maybe madness. But as the coyotes cried on the ridgeline and the desert stretched wide and unforgiving, he realized Clara, May, was no burden. She was a reckoning. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Durney gang was coming, carrying the promise of fire and blood. Clara's eyes burned brighter than the flames that night, as if she'd been born to ride straight into the storm. Eli didn't know if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever she was, whoever she had been, his fate was now bound to hers. The wind howled through the rafters, and the ranch waited in silence, bracing for what was to come. The desert had a way of stripping men down to their bones. Out here, the sun judged everything, burning away weakness and mercy alike. Eli McGraw felt it every day as he bent his back to the fences, dug at the brittle earth for water, and fought to keep his cattle alive. The land wanted him gone, same as it had driven off a dozen other ranchers. But Eli was stubborn, holding fast to what little was left. And then there was Clara May, who worked beside him with a fire in her that startled him more each passing day. She never waited to be told what to do. At dawn, she was already in the corral, whispering to the colts that kicked and snorted against the ropes. Eli had tried breaking horses for years, knew the sweat and fury of it, but Clara did it differently. She didn't fight them. She looked them in the eye, moved with them, spoke in low tones that carried a strange calm. And when she swung into the saddle, the wildest bronc bucked once, twice, then bent its will to hers. The hands that had stayed on with Eli stared in awe. "She's got the devil's charm," one of them muttered, wiping dust from his brow. Eli didn't answer. He only watched, uneasy yet impressed, wondering what road had carved such certainty into her. Bits of her past came out in fragments, like glass shards scattered in the dirt. She'd mention a place, a trail, the sound of bullets tearing through night air. Once, when they found the carcass of a steer stripped by wolves, she stared at it and murmured, "Better than what they used to leave for warnings." Eli asked who they were, but she only shook her head and moved on. The whispers in town filled in what she wouldn't say. Folks claimed she'd run with a gang once, too young, too wild, riding hard and shooting straighter than most men. Some said she'd slit a sheriff's throat. Others swore she was a bandit's daughter, abandoned when the noose caught up with him. Eli listened without confirming or denying. Truth was, he didn't know. And though part of him wanted to, another part feared what would happen if he asked. What he did know was that she saved him time and again. When a section of the north fence collapsed, Clara had it rigged back together with wire and rawhide before Eli had fetched the tools. When cattle scattered during a thunderstorm, she rode through lightning and mud to herd them back, singing a wordless tune that carried across the storm. She wasn't the broken girl the world had laughed at on the auction block. She was iron-wrapped in flesh. Eli found himself watching her in quiet moments, the way the sweat glistened on her brow after a day's labor, the way her laughter, rare and raw, cracked through the silence like water in a dry creek. Slowly, he stopped seeing her as a burden and began seeing her as something else entirely. Not tamed, not conquered, but unyielding. And for a man hollowed by grief, that unyielding fire gave him something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But shadows were lengthening across the desert. News of the Durney gang traveled like smoke. Stagecoaches robbed, ranches burned to the ground, families left with nothing but ashes and fear. Their name carried weight, killers with no mercy, a pack of wolves tearing at the edges of the frontier. Eli heard it in town, saw the worry in every set of eyes. The law was too thin, the land too wide, and the Durneys too ruthless. It wasn't long before signs of them brushed against Eli's ranch. A steer went missing from the south pasture. Then another. Tracks in the dirt showed horses ridden hard, heavier than stray rustlers. One evening, a faint column of smoke rose on the horizon, miles away, but close enough to make the air smell faintly of charred wood. Clara noticed it before he did. "They'll come here too," she said, her voice flat, certain. Eli set his jaw. "We'll be ready." Her gaze cut through him like a blade. "Ready with what? Rusted rifles and prayers? You've got 3 hands who'd scatter at the first shot fired." He hated that she was right, hated the helplessness that crept into his chest. But Clara wasn't speaking from fear. She spoke like someone who'd already lived through it, someone who knew the shape of violence. That night, Eli lay awake in his bed, listening to the boards creak as Clara moved through the house, restless, never sleeping long. He wondered what demons kept her awake, what memories pressed against her ribs until she had to pace in the dark. The truth was clawing closer, but he didn't press her. The desert kept its secrets until it was ready to spill them. The attack came just after dawn a week later. Eli had risen early, pitching feed into the troughs, when a crack split the air, rifle fire. Then shouts, wild whoops, and the pounding of hooves. Dust rolled over the ridge as riders stormed the pasture, rifles flashing. The cattle bawled and scattered, driven into chaos. Eli ran for his rifle, firing back, but the gang came like a swarm. A shot grazed his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dirt. His men fled, one dropping his gun, another spurring his horse so fast he nearly trampled Eli. The Durneys didn't linger. They whooped, cut down 2 head of cattle, and left Eli bleeding in the dust with the echo of their laughter behind him. It was a message, clear as fire. They'd be back, and next time they wouldn't leave him breathing. Clara was there in a heartbeat, pulling him to his feet, her hand steady against the blood on his shirt. Her eyes weren't frightened. They burned with something sharper, something fierce. "You see now," she said, her voice low but steady. "They're not shadows. They're coming. And when they do, you'll need more than prayers." Eli swayed, chest heaving, pain burning through him. "Then what do we do?" Clara looked out over the torn pasture, the dust still hanging in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Her jaw tightened. "We stand. And this time, McGraw, we don't break." The desert stretched wide and merciless around them, the sun climbing higher, but Eli felt something shift then. Clara wasn't just a girl thrown into his life by chance. She was steel forged by fire, and the storm was only beginning. The night after the raid, silence lay heavy over the ranch. Eli sat at the table, his shirt torn and stiff with blood, staring at the lantern's dim glow. Clara stood across from him, arms crossed, eyes hard. She had patched his wound without flinching, but her words since then had been few, carried on a tension that coiled through the air like a rattler ready to strike. Finally, she broke it. "You deserve the truth, McGraw." Eli lifted his eyes. "Truth about what?" She leaned forward, palms pressing the scarred wood of the table. "About who I am. About why I'm not afraid of the Durneys. Why I know the way they think, the way they ride." The lantern flame wavered as if stirred by her words. She drew in a long breath. My father was Jebediah Crow. You know the name. Eli froze. Every man on the frontier knew the name. Jeb Crow had been a ghost story told around campfires, an outlaw whose skill with horse and gun had made him untouchable for years, until one winter he disappeared, leaving only rumors of betrayal and blood. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. I was his daughter. He raised me with a saddle for a cradle and a pistol for a toy. I rode with him until I was 12, learned to shoot straight before I could read. When the law and rival gangs closed in, he left me behind, said the world would devour me if I stayed. So I learned to survive on my own. Eli's chest tightened as her eyes locked with his. There was no pride in her voice, no boast, only the ache of truth. That's why you're not afraid, he said quietly. That's why I know what's coming. She straightened, her shadow tall on the wall. And if you want to keep this ranch, if you want to live, then you need to trust me. Let me take charge. Eli stared at her, torn between disbelief and awe. Then he nodded, slow but firm. Tell me what to do. From that night forward, the ranch changed. Clara moved with authority, her voice sharp as a whip. She drilled the few hands who hadn't run, teaching them how to load quick, how to shoot straight, how to keep nerves steady when hooves thundered. She led Eli through the canyons at dawn, showing him where to place hidden rifles, where to dig pits along the trails, where to rig wire that would trip charging horses. The neighboring ranchers, weary and afraid, drifted in when they heard what was stirring at the McGraw place. Clara faced them without hesitation. You can flee, leave your land to burn, or you can fight. If you fight with me. Something in her voice, that steel born of fire, cut through their doubt. One by one they stayed. Eli watched her from the edge of each gathering, struck by the way hardened men listened to her as if she carried a general's badge. He felt the bond between them tightening, drawn not by romance alone, but by the forge of survival. At night, when the campfires burned low, they'd share quiet moments, Eli confessing how he still dreamed of his late wife, Clara confessing how she still heard her father's voice in the crack of gunfire. They were both haunted, both scarred, yet in those moments they leaned on each other like two pillars, holding the same roof against the storm. The days turned to waiting, each sunrise heavy with expectation. Horses were trained to ride fast and hard, rifles cleaned until they gleamed, traps buried in dust. Clara carried herself with calm certainty, though Eli could see the storm building behind her eyes. And then the horizon darkened. It began with dust, rising like a storm cloud against the setting sun. Eli stood on the ridge, heart hammering as the earth trembled with the rhythm of approaching hooves. The Durney gang was coming, their laughter carrying on the wind like a pack of hyenas. Shadows stretched long across the desert, and the first gunshot cracked the silence like thunder. Clara swung into her saddle, rifle in hand, her hair whipping like a black banner. "This is it," she shouted, voice carrying clear over the fear thick in the air. "Stand your ground." The world erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed through the canyon, dust choking the air, horses screaming as hidden wires snapped taut. Men shouted, rifles barked, and the Durneys charged with reckless fury. Clara was everywhere at once. From the saddle, she rode like a storm unleashed, her rifle kicking against her shoulder, every shot placed with deadly precision. A rider broke through the fence line. She dropped him with a single shot, wheeled her horse, and barked orders to hold the flank. Another came at Eli, pistol raised. Eli fired, his bullet finding its mark, but it was Clara's fierce cry that steadied his shaking hands. The ranch hands fought with grit they hadn't known they possessed, emboldened by the sight of her. She led them with a fearlessness that seemed almost unearthly, charging into the thick of dust and blood, her silhouette blazing against the firelight of burning brush. Eli fought beside her, pain forgotten, spirit burning with something he hadn't felt since his wife lived, purpose. Where she moved, he followed, covering her back, his heart beating in rhythm with hers. When the Durneys pressed hard against the corral, it was Eli and Clara side by side, firing into the smoke, their voices shouting above the storm. The outlaws reeled against the resistance they hadn't expected. Traps snapped, rifles cracked, horses stumbled in hidden pits. Still they pressed, wild and merciless, but Clara never faltered. At one point, when the dust cleared just enough, Eli saw her on horseback, rifle raised, eyes blazing like coals. She was no longer the girl sold at an auction block, no longer a shadow of someone else's story. She was the fire itself, the kind of legend the desert whispered about long after the smoke cleared. And as Eli fought beside her, he understood what she had meant when she said she wasn't meant to be tamed. She wasn't meant to be owned, bent, or broken. She was meant to ride beside a man who would not flinch in the storm. And together, they were a storm no outlaw could contain. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth against the morning sky, red rock gleaming in the first burn of daylight. Dust still hung in the air from the night's clash at the ranch, and the ground bore scars, spent shells, broken wood, the imprint of hooves gouging the earth in panic. Eli McGraw rode with Clara at the head of the small band of ranchers who had survived the onslaught. Their faces were hard, their eyes hollow from loss, but in each of them burned a new kind of fire. Clara had lit it, and Eli knew it. The Durney gang had not been broken. They had retreated into the canyon country, a place of narrow passes and shadowed hollows, where outlaws had hidden for generations. If they were not hunted down now, they would return, more vicious, more certain to bleed the land dry. Clara knew it better than anyone, and so she led them into the stone labyrinth, where she herself had once learned the cruel geometry of ambush and escape. "Keep close," she ordered, her voice low but carrying. "They'll be waiting. They always are." Eli watched her silhouette against the rising sun, straight-backed, rifle strapped across her shoulder, every movement purposeful. She looked more like a commander than any lawman he'd ever seen. He felt a strange pride swelling in his chest, not just in her skill, but in the bond that had formed between them. He trusted her with his life, and for a man who had lost so much, that trust was a gift worth more than land or cattle. They entered the canyon at noon, when the rocks glowed hot enough to burn bare skin. The air was still, heavy with silence. It was Clara who reined in first, raising her hand. "They're here." The first rifle cracked from above, a shot whistling past Eli's ear to shatter against the stone. Chaos erupted, echoing gunfire, the thunder of horses, the Durney gang spilling from hidden alcoves like wolves from their den. Dust boiled upward as men shouted, bullets sparking against rock. "Hold the ridge." Clara's command rang out like steel striking steel. She rode forward, fearless, her rifle rising to answer the ambush. One outlaw fell, then another, her shots as precise as if the canyon itself bent to guide them. Eli followed, firing steady, keeping her flank clear as she drove their defense into motion. The ranchers rallied, emboldened by her fire. They took cover behind boulders, trading shots with outlaws who cursed and spat from the shadows. But the Durneys were many, more than Eli had feared, their numbers stretching like a tide of dust and fury. At one point, a rider charged down the slope, pistol raised, eyes fixed on Clara. Eli felt his blood freeze, then burn. He fired before the man could pull the trigger, his shot slamming the outlaw from the saddle. Clara glanced back once, her eyes locking with Eli's. No words passed, but the look said everything, that they were bound, side by side, neither yielding. The canyon rang with the sound of battle. Clara moved with a fury that stunned even the Durneys. She rode straight into their midst, using the tight turns of the canyon to outflank them, her rifle barking, her horse leaping through dust and gun smoke. She knew their tactics before they tried them, where they'd place a sniper, where they'd circle back for a surprise charge. Every move they made, she countered, not with hesitation, but with the certainty of one who had been raised in that very language of violence. Eli stayed close, heart hammering, his shoulder aching but his aim true. He was no legend, no outlaw's child, but Clara's courage flowed into him like blood. He covered her when she darted across open ground, pulled her back when a bullet splintered the rock at her head. Together, they fought like halves of one blade, cutting through the tide. The battle pressed deeper into the canyon. The Durneys fell, but more rose behind them, shouting with desperation. Clara wheeled her horse onto higher ground, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Now, drive them into the narrows." The ranchers obeyed, herding the gang toward the tightest bend of the canyon. The outlaws, thinking they cornered their prey, charged after them. But Clara had set the trap. Along the ridge, hidden wires snapped taut, sending horses reeling. Dust blinded the riders, and the canyon's own walls boxed them in. Eli felt the ground tremble as the clash reached its fever pitch. Gunfire roared, men screamed, horses crashed against stone. Clara stood tall in the saddle, a figure of fire and defiance, her rifle never missing its mark. Eli's chest burned with pride and awe. She was no wild girl to be bought or broken. She was the heart of the fight, the very soul of survival. In the chaos, the leader of the Durneys, Grady Durney himself, charged forward, a scarred giant bellowing curses, pistol aimed squarely at Clara. Eli's blood iced. He fired, but his bullet only grazed the outlaw's arm. Grady bore down on her, fury blazing in his eyes. Clara spun, her rifle rising, but the outlaw was close, too close. Eli spurred forward, slamming his horse into Grady's mount. They collided, gunfire splitting the air. Eli's shot landed clean this time, striking true. Grady toppled from the saddle with a roar that ended in silence, his pistol skittering across the stone. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara raised her rifle high, her cry ringing through the dust. "They're broken. Drive them out." The remaining Durneys scattered, their will shattered, their leader dead. The ranchers surged, chasing them down the canyon until only silence remained, broken only by the groan of wounded horses and the ragged breaths of men who had fought harder than they ever thought possible. Eli dismounted, his legs trembling, his body aching with every bruise and burn. Clara stood beside him, hair wild, face streaked with dust and sweat, eyes blazing like coals in the twilight. He looked at her and saw not the girl sold in auction, not the outlaw's daughter whispered about in rumors, but the warrior who had saved them all. The ranchers gathered, battered but alive, their eyes fixed on her with reverence. Not one of them laughed now. They spoke her name with awe, as though a legend had stepped from the dust and stone. In the days that followed, word spread like wildfire. Townsfolk whispered of Clara May, the woman too wild for any man to own, who had led a stand against the Durneys and won. Children played at being her. Ranchers repeated her orders as though they were scripture, and Eli McGraw's ranch, once a place of quiet despair, became the heart of a new beginning. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars spread wide, Eli and Clara stood on the ridge together, watching the land stretch endless before them. He reached for her hand, rough against rough, and she didn't pull away. The narrator's voice seemed to belong to the wind itself as it carried the truth into the night. They called her too wild for any man, but the truth was she was never meant to be owned, only to ride where justice needed her most.